Picture an intellectual standoff in the early 1930s. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and utter frustration. Two brilliant factions of economists are essentially screaming at each other over a single, seemingly basic question: what makes a thing valuable? On one side, the Marxists, insisting it's the raw sweat, time, and labor poured into making it. On the other, the Austrian marginalists, pointing at the consumer and saying, no, it's just about human desire, how badly someone wants to buy it. It's a total stalemate. Neither side can decisively prove the other wrong with hard data. Everything just grinds to an academic halt. So a young New York philosopher named Sidney Hook walks into this mess. He isn't an economist. He doesn't even try to check their math, resolve the price of production discrepancies, or solve their equations. Instead, he looks at this paralyzed debate and does something completely unexpected. He basically asks, what if it doesn't matter who is empirically right? What if we stop looking for an unquestionable mathematical law and just pick the theory that is actually useful for decoding the machinery of capitalism? What really struck me about this wasn't just the sheer audacity of a philosopher walking into a room of economists and brushing aside decades of complex theory, but how shifting the goalpost from absolute truth to practical utility completely blew open a question that everyone else was completely stuck on.
And, the sheer magnitude of that gridlock is it's difficult to overstate. To genuinely grasp why Sidney Hook's intervention was necessary, we actually have to trace the roots of this specific intellectual paralysis back several decades.
Right.
So imagine you were in Vienna, and it's the year 1904.
Okay, Vienna, 1904.
Yeah. The atmosphere of the city is intensely intellectual. It's this melting pot of radical political organizing and, very conservative high academia. And right in the middle of this is a man named Karl. Karl is a junior typesetter working for a radical publishing house.
So we're talking about a very physical, demanding environment, right? Like a print shop in 1904 is no joke.
Exactly. Karl's reality is entirely tangible. His day is measured out in the physical sorting of heavy lead letters. There is this constant stinging smell of kerosene used to clean the presses. His thumbs are permanently smudged with wet ink.
Wow.
And on this particular night, the text he is setting into type is a galley proof for a man named Rudolf Hilferding. Hilferding is writing a direct response to Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk.
And Böhm-Bawerk he's essentially the towering figure of bourgeois Austrian economics at the time, right?
And Karl actually has a personal connection to this debate. It isn't just abstract theory to him at all.
Really? So?
Well, it's intimately tied to his own family dynamic. Karl's brother works as an accounting clerk, so he's a white-collar professional who absolutely worships Böhm-Bawerk.
Interesting. So you have the blue-collar typesetter and the white-collar accountant.
Exactly. And brother is obsessed with the concept of subjective prices. He constantly argues with Karl, telling him that the value of anything, let's say a loaf of bread, has absolutely nothing to do with the farmer who grew the wheat or the baker who kneaded the dough.
Right, because that's a labor perspective.
Right. Instead, the brother argues that the value of that bread is strictly, entirely dictated by what a starving man is willing to pay for it in that specific isolated moment of transaction.
Yes, that is the essence of the Austrian marginalist perspective. It just isolates the moment of exchange. The consumer's desire creates the value out of thin air.
But as Karl stands there in that poorly lit, cramped printing room, physically arranging Hilferding's dense theoretical phrasing, he experiences this profound, almost nauseating sense of vertigo.
Vertigo. Why?
Because Hilferding is doing the exact opposite of what the brother does. Hilferding is pulling the camera way, way back. He is soaring above the individual bakeries and the isolated transactions, pulling the view up into this dizzying stratosphere of abstraction.
Wait, let's stay with that vertigo for a second because the contrast is staggering. If you look at it through the brother's eyes, reality is just this chaotic, buzzing swarm of bees.
Yes, the swarm.
Right, every single bee is an individual price fluctuating wildly based on random, subjective human desires on any given Tuesday. But Hilferding isn't looking at the bees at all. He's trying to describe the rigid, hidden geometry of the hive itself.
And that realization hits Karl like a physical weight. The profound vulnerability of the working class suddenly becomes clear to him. He wipes this smear of black ink from his forehead. His stomach is literally growling from poor wages, and he understands the paradox.
Yes.
To understand their own daily poverty, the working class has to temporarily blind themselves to those immediate, obvious prices sitting right there in the shop window. They have to grasp an invisible, stratified layer of social reality that fundamentally governs all of them. To fight a systemic ghost, you have to learn how to see in the dark.
Wow. But wait, why did Hilferding have to pull the camera that far back in the first place? Why was this intense level of abstraction necessary just to defend Marx's labor theory of value against Böhm-Bawerk?
To understand that, we have to unpack the exact weapon Böhm-Bawerk was using against Marx. Böhm-Bawerk had pointed out what appeared to be a fatal, completely irreconcilable mathematical contradiction right in the middle of Marx's masterwork, Capital.
Okay, let's break this down carefully. What exactly was the contradiction? Because math is math.
It involves the transition from Volume 1 of Capital to Volume 3. In Volume 1, Marx lays out the foundational premise, which is the labor theory of value. He argues that commodities exchange in the market based on the socially necessary labor time embodied within them. So if it takes 10 hours of average social labor to make a coat, and 10 hours of average social labor to weave 20 yards of linen, those two items hold the exact same value and will exchange at a 1-to-1 ratio. It is a highly elegant, unifying, and, well, mathematically satisfying concept.
Right. Value equals the sweat and time put into the object. But then Volume 3 happens.
And then Volume 3 happens. In Volume 3, Marx introduces the chaotic reality of capitalist competition. He acknowledges a fundamental law of markets, which is that capital is liquid, and it constantly moves around seeking the absolute highest rate of return. If one industry is highly profitable, investors pull their money out of other sectors and flood into that highly profitable industry.
Which naturally increases competition in that sector, drives down the prices of their goods, and eventually lowers the profit rate until it averages out with the rest of the economy.
Correct. This process eventually equalizes profit rates across all different industries. But here's the massive problem. Different industries use vastly different proportions of machinery versus human labor. Marx called this the organic composition of capital.
Okay, we definitely need to unpack organic composition of capital. Let's use a highly concrete example so we aren't just trading academic terms. Imagine two different businesses. Business A is a massive automated steel mill. It has $50 million in heavy machinery, blast furnaces, and robotics, but it only employs 10 workers to push the buttons. Now, Business B is an industrial bakery. It has only $50,000 in basic ovens, but it employs 500 workers who are kneading dough and icing cakes by hand.
That is a perfect setup. Now, apply Marx's Volume 1 theory to your two businesses. If new value and profit are strictly created by the exploitation of living human labor, the sweat and time of the workers, then Business B, the bakery, with 500 workers, should be generating an absolute mountain of new value and a massive rate of profit compared to its initial investment.
Right, because of all the human labor.
Exactly. And Business A, the steel mill, with only 10 workers, should be generating very little new value despite its huge machines. Because machines don't create new value in Marxist theory, they just transfer their existing value to the product.
Okay, I follow the logic. Under Volume 1 rules, the bakery is vastly more profitable than the steel mill. But we just established in Volume 3 that in the real world, capital moves around until profit rates equalize. I mean, the investors wouldn't stand for the steel mill making a 1% return, while the bakery makes a 50% return.
Exactly. The investors pull money from steel and put it into bakeries. This competition forces the prices of bakery goods down and allows the prices of steel to rise until both businesses are making, let's say, a 10% average rate of profit. Marx called these new adjusted prices the prices of production.
And if the price of bread drops and the price of steel rises, just to ensure the investors get an equal return, then the final market prices have completely detached from the original labor hours required to make them.
You have just walked directly into Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk's trap.
Oh!
Yeah, this was his exact critique. He looked at this and said, look at the math. Volume 3 entirely contradicts Volume 1. If market prices systematically and permanently deviate from the labor values just to equalize profit rates, then labor isn't the real determinant of value at all. The entire theory collapses on the rocks of empirical reality.
Honestly, from the perspective of Karl's brother, the accountant who only looks at the final ledger, Böhm-Bawerk just unequivocally won the argument. He proved that the labor theory of value is a broken compass. It says north is 10 hours of labor, but the needle is pointing at a price determined by investor profit equalization. How could Hilferding possibly defend Marx against a purely mathematical contradiction like that?
Hilferding defended it by fundamentally changing the definition of what the compass was designed to measure. Hilferding argued that Böhm-Bawerk's entire critique rested on a massive category error. Böhm-Bawerk was confusing value with price.
How are those two things different? Because in everyday language, we use them interchangeably.
In everyday language, yes, we do. But in Marx's architecture, they're entirely different realms of reality. Böhm-Bawerk wanted the theory of value to be a predictive algorithm. He wanted a formula where you could plug in labor hours and perfectly predict the absolute height of individual prices on the market on any given day.
Which you can't do.
Right. But Hilferding countered that the labor theory of value operates at a much deeper, far more profound level of abstraction. It is not a price prediction mechanism. Value, for Marx, is the underlying social relation of production.
Underlying social relation, that sounds very abstract.
Think of it as the invisible connective tissue of an atomized society. In capitalism, we don't produce goods collectively. We produce them in isolated private bubbles, yet we depend on everyone else's labor to survive. The way our fragmented labor is socially coordinated is through the exchange of commodities. Value is the structural requirement that a certain total amount of human labor exists to sustain society. When Marx talks about values transforming into prices of production, Hilferding argues this is not a contradiction at all. It is the exact description of how that deep social tissue manifests on the chaotic surface of a competitive market. The total value in the system determines the total profit available. Competition just dictates how that total pool of profit is distributed among different capitalists.
I want to introduce an analogy here because what you are describing perfectly explains the vertigo Karl felt in that print shop. If you adopt the Austrian marginalist perspective of Böhm-Bawerk, economics is basically the equivalent of a daily weather report.
A weather report.
Yeah, you are entirely focused on immediate, observable, empirical phenomena. What is the exact temperature right now? Is it raining? What is the price of a loaf of bread today? And that perspective is undeniably useful if you are just an individual consumer trying to figure out whether you need to grab an umbrella before you leave the house.
It is functionally useful for surface-level survival, yes.
But Marx's labor theory of value, as Hilferding explains it, is not a weather report. It is climate science. Climate science is the study of invisible atmospheric pressures, the deep oceanic currents, the historical shifts in greenhouse gases. You cannot step outside your front door, point at the sky, and physically show me the climate. You can only feel the immediate weather, but the weather, every storm, every heat wave, is entirely generated by the underlying climate. Böhm-Bawerk is standing in a rainstorm, pointing at a thermometer and screaming that atmospheric pressure doesn't exist because the thermometer only shows degrees Celsius.
That analogy touches on something deeply profound that emerged much later in the philosophy of science. Decades after Hilferding, a philosopher named Roy Bhaskar formalized this exact distinction with a concept called critical realism.
Critical realism. Let's unpack the mechanics of that philosophy.
Bhaskar argued that reality is not flat. It is stratified. It exists in layers. At the very top, you have what he calls the empirical domain. This is strictly what humans can directly observe and measure. The thermometer readings, the daily market prices, the swarm of bees.
Okay, the empirical layer.
Below that, you have the actual domain. These are events that happen in the world, whether a human being is there to observe and record them or not.
So a tree falling in a forest with no one around is in the actual domain, but not the empirical domain.
Exactly. But critical realism goes one step further. At the very bottom layer of reality is the domain of the real. This domain consists entirely of what Bhaskar calls generative mechanisms.
Generative mechanisms.
Yes. These are the underlying structures, the causal powers, the deep oceanic currents that actually generate the events that eventually bubble up to the surface. Hilferding's defense of Marx is essentially a pioneering early work of critical realism. Hilferding is telling Böhm-Bawerk that true science must study the hidden generative mechanisms, the structural social relations of labor, not just passively track the surface empirical data of fluctuating prices.
Because if you only study the prices, you are trapped on the surface layer forever.
If you only track daily temperatures, you can never explain the laws of motion that govern global warming. If you only track market prices, you can never explain the historical laws of motion that govern the entire capitalist system. You are blind to the underlying engine.
And this brings us right back to Karl's vertigo. He realizes that to understand his own exploitation, the very reason his stomach is growling while he prints this text, he has to look past the buzzing swarm of individual prices and perceive the architecture of the hive itself. But, as powerful and poetic as that realization is, it presents a massive, almost insurmountable practical problem. If this generative mechanism, this concept of value, is so deeply abstracted from the daily prices we interact with, how do you prove it is actually there?
Right, that is the problem.
If it doesn't match the numbers in the ledger, how do you know you aren't just hallucinating a theory? Which brings us out of the European debates of the early 1900s and across the Atlantic into the raw industrial despair of the American Great Depression. Imagine you are in New York City in the year 1933.
A very different world from Vienna.
The setting is a Washington Square classroom. The radiator in the corner is hissing violently. It has this mechanical, rhythmic thumping sound.
A sound that is highly reminiscent of the industrial garment presses operating just a few blocks away on 7th Avenue.
Exactly. And sitting in the back row of the seminar is a man named Elias. Elias is 32 years old. He's a union organizer. He has permanent dark grease embedded under his fingernails. He is not a wealthy academic. He is a man fighting a literal ground war against factory owners.
He's on the front lines.
And Elias has come to this specific classroom seeking a weapon. He wants absolute scientific proof. He wants an ironclad, mathematically verifiable certainty that the factory owner is systematically robbing him of his labor. He wants to take Marx's equations and slam them on the boss's desk.
But instead of handing Elias a mathematical weapon, the young professor at the front of the room is systematically dismantling the very concept of absolute certainty. That professor is Sidney Hook.
Describe Sidney Hook in this moment. What is he doing?
Hook is sharp-eyed, highly restless, and pacing aggressively in front of a massive chalkboard. He is writing out complex equations of value and then immediately taking an eraser and wiping them away. He is intentionally frustrating the orthodox expectations of his students.
I can imagine the tension in that room.
Oh, it was thick. He looks at this room full of eager radicals and says, it cannot be definitively proven. His voice cuts right through the stuffy, overheated air of the classroom. Hook declares, the labor theory is not a photograph of a market. It is an instrument.
I want to focus on Elias's reaction to that word instrument, because to a guy who is putting his life on the line, on the picket lines, hearing that his core ideology is just an instrument and not an absolute verifiable truth, well, that has to feel like a massive betrayal.
It induces a cold knot of panic in his stomach. The logic is terrifying for a true believer. If Marx cannot be mathematically verified by the hard data of the economy, if the price of production discrepancy can never be cleanly solved in the ledger book, then what exactly are they bleeding for in the streets? Are they dying for a metaphor?
Right. But Hook doesn't leave him in that panic. As Hook continues to speak, he compares Marx's theory to a specialized lens. You put the lens on and suddenly the invisible, brutal architecture of capitalism becomes visible. It organizes the chaos. And as Elias listens, his rigid dogmatism begins to crack. He looks out the frosted window of the classroom. There is a massive breadline forming on the street corner in the freezing cold. And Elias realizes that the absolute truth he was looking for isn't going to be found in an accounting ledger. The theory doesn't need to be a passive, perfect mirror of empirical facts. It needs to be a crowbar. It needs to be a tool used to pry the system apart.
Sidney Hook's framing of the theory as a crowbar is vital here because it completely short-circuits the traditional paralyzed rules of the debate between the Marxists and the Austrians. To fully understand Hook's intervention, you have to look at his unique intellectual pedigree. Hook was not a traditional European Marxist. He was an American. Sure. Specifically, he was the star pupil of John Dewey.
John Dewey, the absolute titan of American pragmatism.
Correct. Pragmatism, especially in Dewey's formulation, fundamentally rejects the classical notion of truth. For centuries, philosophers believed that truth was simply a static copy or a perfect mirror reflection of reality. If a theory perfectly mirrored the world, it was true. But pragmatism argues that ideas are not mirrors. Ideas are tools. They are plans of action designed by human beings to solve specific, highly localized problems in our environment.
So Hook takes this deeply American pragmatist framework and fuses it directly onto Marxism.
And in doing so, he initiates a massive two-front war. On one side, he's fighting the bourgeois Austrian economists. But on the other side, he is directly challenging the orthodox communists of his own era. Hook ruthlessly attacked what he called the copybook materialism of the official Communist Party of the 1930s.
Let's define copybook materialism. What did that look like in practice for the Communist Party?
The orthodox Marxists of the 1930s desperately wanted Marxism to be perceived as an inevitable mechanical science. They wanted it to hold the exact same epistemological authority as Newtonian physics. They wanted exactly what Elias originally wanted, absolute, undeniable mathematical proof that history was moving in their direction.
They wanted to know they would inevitably win.
Exactly. They believed Marx's writings were a perfect copy of objective reality. Hook looked at this and said it was a fundamental, disastrous misreading of Marx.
So Hook is standing over this intellectual cage match. The Austrian marginalists are in one corner screaming, your labor theory is garbage because it doesn't match the empirical price data. The orthodox Marxists are in the other corner screaming, our theory is an absolute science of history that explains the deep structure generating the data. Neither side can land a finishing blow.
Right.
And Hook steps into the ring and says, everyone stop. Economic theories can never be conclusively proven by direct appeals to the facts of price movements.
Exactly. Hook recognizes a massive epistemological deadlock. If the Austrians find a discrepancy between their theory and reality, they don't abandon marginalism. They just add a new variable for consumer psychology or friction. If the Marxists find a discrepancy, they don't abandon the labor theory. They just add a variable for capital mobility or monopoly distortion. Both sides can indefinitely massage their equations to deflect any empirical attack.
Since math will never solve the debate, Hook introduces instrumentalism.
Hook argues that the choice between the marginalist paradigm and the Marxist paradigm should never be based on which one is a mathematically flawless photograph of the market. Why? Because neither of them is a flawless photograph. The choice, therefore, must be made on purely pragmatic grounds. We have to ask a different set of questions. Which framework is a more useful instrument? Which crowbar gives us more leverage to understand the dynamics of profit, the historical accumulation of capital, and the structural antagonistic relationship between the people who own the machines and the people who work them?
And for Hook, Marx wins that pragmatic test easily.
Marx's theory is the superior instrument because it actually explains the violent social transformations happening in the real world, the strikes, the depressions, the monopolies. Marginalism, by contrast, just looks at the existing system, takes it as a natural, eternal given, and tries to mathematically optimize it.
I'm going to push back heavily here because while that sounds intellectually liberating, I think a lot of people hearing this are going to feel that exact same betrayal Elias felt in the classroom. If a theory is just an instrument, if it's just a crowbar, does that mean we are completely abandoning the pursuit of actual truth?
That's our question.
Is Hook basically saying, hey, since we can't win the math debate, let's just cheat, change the rules of science, and adopt whatever economic theory is politically convenient for our social agenda? That doesn't sound like science. It sounds like cynical political maneuvering.
That is the exact word-for-word accusation that was hurled at Sidney Hook. Mainstream economists called him a propagandist, and orthodox communists actually expelled him from their circles for this exact heresy. They accused him of abandoning objective truth. But that accusation represents a profound misunderstanding of pragmatism. Hook is not saying that truth is entirely subjective. He isn't saying we can just invent convenient fictions and call them science.
Then how does he defend this without it devolving into my truth versus your truth?
He defends it by elevating the debate into the philosophy of science. What Hook is doing here is nothing short of visionary. His pragmatic approach brilliantly prefigures the work of Thomas Kuhn, who decades later would become world famous for his arguments about paradigm incommensurability.
Let's walk through paradigm incommensurability.
Imagine two people looking at a classic optical illusion, the drawing that looks like either a duck or a rabbit. One person sees the duck, the other sees the rabbit. They're looking at the exact same lines on the paper, the exact same raw data, but their brains are organizing that data into two completely different, mutually exclusive realities.
Okay, yes, I know that drawing.
This is what Kuhn meant by paradigms. Hook recognized 30 years before Kuhn that the Marxists and the Austrians were not just disagreeing about a few isolated facts, they were using completely different conceptual vocabularies. They were operating inside fundamentally different paradigms.
So when a marginalist looks at the economy, they are wearing the duck glasses. They look out and see millions of individual, rational consumers trying to maximize their personal utility. But when a Marxist looks at the exact same economy, they are wearing the rabbit glasses. They see structural classes locked in a historical conflict over surplus value.
Exactly. And because they are operating in different paradigms, their criteria for what actually counts as proof are completely different. Therefore, their theories are incommensurable. You literally cannot use the internal mathematical logic of the marginalist paradigm to disprove the Marxist paradigm. Just like you can't use the rules of chess to prove that a poker player made a bad move. Because the paradigms cannot communicate with each other mathematically, you have to evaluate the paradigm as a whole entity based on its total problem-solving capacity in the real world.
So Hook is saying that in complex social sciences, truth is not demonstrated by perfectly predicting a numeric value on a spreadsheet. Truth is demonstrated by a theory's ability to successfully guide human action and decode massive, complex historical processes over time.
And this leads us to the terrifying realization that is waiting for us beneath this philosophy. The underlying reason we have to rely on pragmatic utility, the reason Hook's instrumentalism is absolutely necessary, is because the raw empirical data itself is fundamentally broken. It is insufficient to give us the answers we crave.
Which brings us to the tragedy of Arthur. Imagine Chicago in 1936, deep in the bowels of a government recovery board. The room is dead silent except for the ticking of a clock. The desk is an absolute graveyard. It is tiled high with census reports, commodity indices, agricultural outputs, and steel production quotas.
The raw, unfiltered mathematical residue of a broken nation.
Exactly. And sitting at this desk is Arthur, an exhausted government statistician working the night shift. He is rubbing his burning eyes. For 6 straight months, Arthur has been operating in secret. He's been taking all this empirical data of the Great Depression, and he is trying to map it onto a singular, unifying theory of economic value. He wants to mathematically settle the debates that are raging in the universities. He wants the numbers to declare a winner.
And what Arthur experiences is a descent into bureaucratic madness.
Complete madness, because Arthur discovers a horrifying mathematical reality. If he takes the neoclassical Austrian models of subjective preference and applies them to the data of the Depression, well, the data fits perfectly. The equations balance. But if he takes the exact same numbers, the exact same factory outputs and unemployment rates, and applies the Marxist labor framework, the exact same numbers fit seamlessly, this time pointing to a structural crisis of overaccumulation. The numbers are entirely agnostic.
They refuse to confess.
They refuse to confess. Arthur pours himself a lukewarm cup of coffee, and this wave of bitter, exhausted relief washes over him. The absurdity of his entire profession becomes clear. The data will never, ever choose a winner. Sidney Hook had been right all along. As Arthur stares down at these columns of black ink that represents millions of evicted families and ruined lives, he feels a strange, liberating numbness. He closes the thick ledger book. The thud echoes in the empty office. He knows the math will never save them.
Arthur has just collided head-on with one of the most powerful, unsettling, and vital concepts in the entire philosophy of science. It is called the underdetermination of theory by evidence.
Underdetermination. Let's unpack the mechanics of how data can betray us like this.
In formal academic terms, this is known as the Duhem-Quine thesis. It builds on earlier mathematical arguments by the French physicist Henri Poincaré regarding the nature of geometry. The core principle of underdetermination states that empirical data alone rarely, if ever, determines a single, uniquely correct theoretical framework.
Why? If I have 10 data points, shouldn't there only be one line that perfectly connects them?
In a pure abstract vacuum, perhaps. But theories are never tested in isolation. You never test a single hypothesis against the raw universe. Theories are tested alongside a massive, tangled web of background beliefs, measurement techniques, and what philosophers call auxiliary assumptions.
Auxiliary assumptions. Give me a concrete example of this outside of economics, just to lock in the concept.
Think of Galileo looking through his telescope and claiming he sees moons orbiting Jupiter. The core theory is that Jupiter has moons. The data is the bright dots in the lens of the telescope. But for that data to prove the theory, there is a massive auxiliary assumption hidden in the background. The assumption is that the telescope's lenses are accurately transmitting light from space, rather than creating optical distortions inside the tube. If the church rejects the auxiliary assumption and says, well, telescopes are flawed instruments that create illusions, then the exact same data, the bright dots, no longer proves Jupiter has moons. It proves Galileo has a defective tube.
Brilliant. Now apply that back to Arthur going mad at his desk.
When Arthur looks at the statistical data of the Great Depression, the raw numbers are underdetermined. If an empirical observation seems to contradict the Austrian neoclassical theory, the Austrians don't throw out their core belief in subjective utility. They just tweak an auxiliary assumption. They say, the data looks weird because of government interference or market friction or irrational consumer panic. And the Marxists do the exact same thing. If the price data doesn't match the labor theory, they adjust an auxiliary assumption about the organic composition of capital or the speed of monopoly consolidation. Both sides can perfectly accommodate the exact same historical data by adjusting the invisible dials in the background.
I want to translate this into an analogy that I think exposes how terrifying this is for the field of economics. It is akin to a homicide detective walking into a crime scene. The detective looks down and finds a set of muddy footprints on the carpet. That is the raw empirical data. But the detective quickly realizes that those exact same muddy footprints can be used to perfectly, flawlessly convict two entirely different suspects, depending entirely on which background assumptions the jury accepts.
Exactly. Walk us through how the jury interprets the footprint.
Well, if the prosecution convinces the jury to accept the assumption that suspect A was wearing heavy work boots to hide his tracks, then the footprints are absolute mathematical proof that suspect A is guilty. However, if the defense convinces the jury to accept the assumption that suspect B intentionally stole suspect A's boots and planted the tracks to frame him, then the exact same footprints are absolute mathematical proof that suspect B is guilty. The footprint itself, the raw data, is completely mute. It has no voice. It does not point a finger.
That analogy perfectly captures the Böhm-Bawerk thesis, and the implications of that mute footprint for modern economics are staggering. Sidney Hook's early recognition of this underdetermination is not just a piece of 1930s trivia. It remains an absolute cornerstone for defending pluralism in heterodox economics today.
How does underdetermination affect the economics we hear about on the news today?
Think about mainstream neoclassical economics, which forms the basis for modern neoliberal market fundamentalism. When neoliberal institutions demand policies like austerity, privatization, or the deregulation of financial markets, they almost always present their arguments not as one theory among many, but as an empirical absolute. They present their policies as if they are dictated by the natural, unyielding laws of math and data. They say, we don't want to cut social services, but the data leaves us no choice.
They treat the data like the footprint that points directly to their exact policy.
Yes. But post-Keynesian economists, ecological economists, and modern Marxists use the concept of underdetermination to shatter that illusion of inevitability. They use Arthur's realization to prove that neoliberalism is just one theoretical framework among many. It is a choice. It is not an empirical inevitability dictated by nature. The data of a recession does not mathematically mandate austerity. It does not mathematically mandate the financialization of the housing market. Those are political choices made within a highly specific paradigm. Because the data is fundamentally underdetermined, we have a philosophical right, arguably a moral duty, to entertain alternative frameworks that might better serve human needs or planetary survival.
Okay, I follow the philosophical logic. If the data is mute, we have to choose the theory that works best for our goals. But this raises a massive, glaring question. If the data is underdetermined, and if these different paradigms are basically just different languages looking at duck-rabbit optical illusions, then why does mainstream economics try so incredibly hard to pretend it is a hard, mathematically verifiable science like physics? Why are college economics textbooks filled from cover to cover with calculus, differential equations, and Greek letters that look exactly like what you would see in a quantum mechanics class?
This brings us to a devastating critique formulated by the economic methodologist Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn calls this phenomenon methodological monism.
Methodological monism. Let's dissect that.
Monism is the belief in a single universal system. Methodological monism is the false but incredibly dominant belief that there is only one valid scientific method in existence. Specifically, it is the belief that the highly mathematized experimental method used in natural sciences like physics is the absolute gold standard of truth. And more dangerously, it is the belief that this singular method must be uniformly applied to all other disciplines, including social sciences like economics, if they want to be taken seriously as real science.
So economics is essentially suffering from a century-long case of physics envy. Economists want the prestige of physicists, so they just copy their math homework.
That is exactly what has happened. To achieve this monistic ideal and look like physicists, mainstream economists have blindly imported tools from the natural sciences. Two of the biggest tools they imported are Karl Popper's concept of falsifiability and the heavy, complex statistical machinery of econometrics. But Dusick points out that applying these tools to human action is a profound epistemological error.
I need to push back here. Why is falsifiability an error? Popper's idea that a theory is only scientific if it can be proven wrong sounds like a fantastic safeguard against dogma. If you can't design a test to prove your theory wrong, aren't you just running a cult?
In physics, falsifiability is essential. You must be able to design a test that could theoretically prove your law of gravity is wrong. But human action is fundamentally different from planetary motion. Dusick points out that some of the most foundational, undeniable truths in economics are entirely empirical, yet absolutely non-falsifiable.
Give me an example of an economic truth that cannot be falsified.
Take the core axiom that free exchange involves mutual expected benefit. This means that if two people voluntarily agree to trade goods, they both must expect to be better off after the trade, otherwise they wouldn't agree to do it. This is a profound empirical reality of human behavior. But you cannot possibly design a laboratory experiment to falsify that statement.
Why not?
Because the very act of a voluntary trade carries the premise of expected benefit within it. It is logically baked into the action. If a test subject trades an apple for an orange, you don't need a sensor to measure their expected benefit. The action itself proves the expectation. You can't put a human in a test tube and force them to make a voluntary trade they expect to hate. It defies the logic of human action. Therefore, demanding that all economic truths be falsifiable in a laboratory setting forces economists to ignore the most basic realities of human intent.
And what about econometrics? We see econometrics everywhere. Every time the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, they cite massive statistical probability models. How is that an epistemological error?
Econometrics is built on a mathematical fiction when applied to macroeconomics. The mathematical laws of statistics and probability require you to have a large number of random, repeatable samples drawn from a uniform population. But history does not provide random samples. Macroeconomic events are unique, unrepeatable historical occurrences.
You mean like the 2008 financial crisis?
It's exactly. The 2008 financial crisis, or the Great Depression, or the inflation shock of the 2020s. These are highly specific events caused by unique intersections of politics, technology, and culture. But econometrics treats these unique historical events as if they were random samples drawn from a controlled laboratory experiment. That is invalid.
Right, you can't rerun history.
Exactly. You cannot put the global economy in a test tube, hold all other political variables constant, and run the 2008 crisis 1,000 times to get a clean probability distribution. Treating complex history as a random statistical sample allows economists to run complex equations, but those equations are describing a fantasy world, not reality.
I hear that, and I understand the critique of treating history like a lab experiment. But let me push back again, because I think a lot of mathematically minded people are going to rebel against this. Mathematics inherently brings clarity. It brings rigor. It forces you to state your assumptions clearly. If Dussek is right and we strip the calculus and the econometrics out of economics, aren't we just returning to vague literary ambiguity? Aren't we just letting people write subjective poetry about inflation instead of actually measuring it? Doesn't math prevent us from just making things up?
That is the classic reflexive defense of the methodological monist. But it relies on a false dichotomy. It assumes the only two options are either highly rigorous differential equations or vague emotional poetry. Dussek eloquently deconstructs this. He shows that in economics, mathematics does not prevent you from making things up. In fact, a mathematical formula often smuggles in massive, hidden, highly fictional assumptions that have absolutely no basis in economic reality whatsoever.
How does math smuggle in fiction? Numbers seem completely neutral.
Think about a standard utility function used in microeconomics. It is represented by a smooth curve on a graph. For an economist to use calculus on that curve to find the point of maximum profit, the mathematical model absolutely must assume that human preferences are continuous and differentiable.
Continuous and differentiable, meaning there are no breaks in the curve. It is a perfectly smooth slope.
But human choice is not a smooth, continuous mathematical curve. We do not buy goods in infinitesimally small continuous fractions. We make discrete discontinuous leaps. You don't buy 1.000045 of a car. You buy one car or 0 cars. You don't smoothly transition from loving a brand to hating it. You switch suddenly because of a scandal. But the math cannot handle sudden discrete jumps easily. So the math literally forces the economist to invent a highly distorted, fictionalized version of human behavior just so the calculus equations can be solved.
Wow, okay, that is a paradigm-shifting concept. So the math, rather than bringing objective rigor, is essentially acting as an academic camouflage. It makes the theory look unassailable and highly scientific while completely hiding the fact that the foundational behavioral assumptions are completely divorced from how actual human beings make decisions. It is like building a beautifully engineered, structurally perfect suspension bridge, but building the foundation out of marshmallows. The math of the cables is perfect, but the whole thing collapses because the foundation is fictional.
That is exactly what the illusion of exactness does. It hides the messy, purposeful, teleological nature of human action. Verbal logic, the careful literary philosophical explanation of human motives, historical context, and institutional structures can actually capture the reality of the economy far more precisely and rigorously than a differential equation built on a foundation of fictional mathematical assumptions.
completely Marx. Because if Marx was rejecting this kind of methodological monism, if he knew that you couldn't just build a static, fictional, mathematical model of prices, how exactly did he build his theoretical framework? How did he construct this analytical instrument that Sidney Hook found so incredibly useful as a crowbar?
To understand Marx's architecture, we have to look closely at his starting point in Volume 1 of Capital. The way he begins his analysis is an absolute masterclass in critical realism. If you open a modern neoclassical economics textbook today, how does it usually start? It almost always starts with the isolated individual. They often use the analogy of Robinson Crusoe stranded alone on his island, trying to mathematically maximize his subjective utility by deciding how many coconuts to pick versus how many fish to catch.
Right. They start with one guy, alone, doing math in his head.
That is methodological individualism. Marx explicitly and aggressively rejects this starting point. He does not start his book with an isolated human psyche. He starts with the commodity.
Why is starting with a physical object, a commodity, so structurally important to his theory?
Because human needs, human desires, and human actions do not exist in a vacuum. They presuppose a social context. Society is not just an aggregate pile of isolated Robinson Crusoes interacting randomly. As Marx puts it, society is the sum of the relations in which those individuals stand to one another. You simply cannot understand the individual without first understanding the structural web they are caught in.
Yes.
A person living under feudalism has fundamentally different motivations, fears, and economic behaviors than a person living under modern financial capitalism.
So by starting with the commodity, which is a physical object produced specifically for the purpose of exchange, Marx is anchoring his entire analysis in the actual everyday social reality of capitalism, rather than starting with a hypothetical, isolated psychology experiment.
Exactly. The commodity is the DNA of capitalism. And from the commodity, Marx begins his brilliant process of abstraction. He doesn't look at the specific physical qualities of a table or a coat. He doesn't care about their use values, the fact that a coat keeps you warm or a table holds your dinner. He strips all of that physical utility away. Then he strips away the surface phenomena of money and fluctuating market prices. He abstracts all the way down to the deepest generative mechanism. He isolates the simplest, most universal social form, which is the fact that all commodities, regardless of what they look like, are products of human labor.
But not specific labor. He doesn't care about the difference between the carpenter making the table and the tailor making the coat.
Right. He abstracts it to what he calls abstract human labor, just the raw expenditure of human energy and time. And this leads to Marx's most challenging, complex, and profound concept, which is the double character of labor, and a German term he uses, Wertgegenständlichkeit.
Wertgegenständlichkeit. Yes.
It translates roughly to value materiality or value objectivity. Marx argues that the value of a commodity is entirely a social relation. It lacks a single, solitary atom of physical matter. You cannot put a coat under an electron microscope and find a molecule of value. Value has no mass, no friction, no chemical signature. Yet Marx argues this purely immaterial social relation acts as an objective, massive, undeniable substance inside the capitalist system.
Okay, my brain is twisting into a knot here. I need to challenge this directly. How can a purely social relation, something that is completely immaterial, has no mass, no atoms, and only exists between people, how can that exert a real causal physical force on the world? If it doesn't have a physical reality, isn't it just a metaphor? Isn't it just an idea we made up? How does an idea move factories?
This is the exact moment where Roy Bhaskar's critical realist perspective swoops in and rescues Marx from sounding like a mystic. Remember how Bhaskar defined generative mechanisms in the domain of the real? He defined them as the ways of acting of things. A social relation is not a physical object you can hold in your hand, but it possesses very real, devastating causal powers. Let's use Marx's own analogy to explain this. Marx said that no chemist in history has ever discovered exchange value inside a pearl or a diamond. You cannot physically isolate the social relation.
Because chemically, a diamond is just pressurized carbon.
Exactly. But society remembers. The massive interconnected social ledger remembers the abstract human labor that was required to dig that diamond out of the earth. It is structurally inscribed into the system. And this invisible, immaterial social structure exerts a crushing, undeniable causal force that governs the physical actions of every single individual within the system. It is the force that physically dictates who gets to eat and who starves. It physically dictates where massive steel factories are built and where they are demolished. It dictates who gets to own the machines and who has to sell their time to operate them.
So just because it is immaterial does not mean it isn't objectively real. Gravity is entirely invisible, yet it governs the physical orbits of massive planets. The social relation of value is invisible, yet it governs the physical movement of global capitalism.
This brings us all the way back to the hissing radiator in New York and Sidney Hook's pragmatist intervention.
Right. Because if value is an invisible social relation, Hook's entire point was that you do not validate Marxist theory by taking a tape measure and trying to perfectly calculate surface market prices. You don't validate gravity by measuring a leaf blowing in the wind. You validate the theory by its unparalleled pragmatic ability to illuminate these deep structural generative mechanisms. The theory is an instrument. It is a lens that allows us to finally see the invisible forces pulling the strings. It is the tool that allows Carl in that dark print shop to finally understand the geometry of the hive. And it is the crowbar that allows Elias on the picket line to understand exactly the nature of the machine he is fighting against.
When you trace his entire intellectual journey from the beginning, you see a profound historical evolution in how humanity understands the nature of knowledge itself. We start in Vienna with Rudolf Hilferding defending the stratification of reality. He is insisting that true science must look beneath the chaotic, buzzing swarm of marginalist market prices to find the deep, invisible social relations that actually govern them.
And then we move to New York, where we see Sidney Hook wielding pragmatism like a philosophical crowbar. He argues that we shouldn't be paralyzed by the Austrian demand for an absolute, perfect mathematical mirror of the market. Instead, we must choose the conceptual framework that gives us the most power to actively understand and change the system we live in.
And from there, we plunged into the dark, disorienting reality of empirical underdetermination with Arthur the statistician in Chicago. We confronted the terrifying fact that the raw data of the economy will never simply speak for itself. The exact same data can and will perfectly support wildly different economic paradigms, depending entirely on the hidden auxiliary assumptions you bring to the table.
Which ultimately leads us to the dismantling of methodological monism. We realize that the mainstream obsession with trying to make economics look exactly like Newtonian physics, with its impossible falsifiability tests and its highly fictionalized econometric probability models, is fundamentally epistemologically flawed when you're dealing with the messy, purposeful, teleological nature of human action.
And by clearing away all of that false mathematical monism, we can finally appreciate Marx's architecture of abstraction for what it truly is. It is a brilliant, unparalleled tool of critical realism. It successfully isolates the immaterial but objectively powerful social relations that dictate the historical laws of motion of our society.
The ultimate legacy of this 1930s intellectual standoff is the realization that the persistent demand for absolute mathematical verification in the social sciences often functions as a fortress to protect the status quo. When economic theories are recognized not as neutral mirrors of nature, but as active instruments of social vision, the true battleground shifts from the realm of statistical equations to the moral architecture of society itself.